Good to see all of you. We missed you last week as nature decided that we didn't need to drive, and we took the week off. But something that didn't take the week off, surprise, death. And we're here to talk about it again. I know that this feels like a lot. I was chuckling to myself, I think it was a couple weeks ago. Kathy Tosa was the gathering host, and at the end, when she's thinking of, like, oh, next week, Brad's coming, are you still doing the death? And just kind of the look of, like, crestfallen, like, oh, okay. This is probably one of the least fun series, right? It's kind of hard to spruce this up, but, 'tis the season for dying. Those who work in palliative care or in hospice care know that this season is known within insiders as the death season. Death rates increased 25% in the months of December through January, February. It's not by coincidence that it feels like, oh man, I just heard of somebody else who passed away last week, and there was this death. And death and grief are baked into the season, just like the raisins in your grandmother's fruitcake. It's baked into the season even if the Christmas carols that we hear when we go shopping in the store blare at us otherwise. And I was just having a conversation, and I know probably some of you feel this way too, that carrying heavy weights and heavy grief during this season feels like a lot when Christmas carols are so joyfully telling you to just rejoice at all of the wonderful things in the world when it doesn't feel very wonderful. So today I want to look at why we're so weird about death. This was a little bit of last week's talk that I didn't get to share that we were going to try to build on today, so I'm going to try to cram 2 weeks of talks into one, get a little bit of the highlights there. So we're going to look at why we're so weird about death as a culture. We're going to then zoom out about what different cultures call a good death. And before wrapping up with a few ways that we could think about our own good death. But since it's the Christmas season, and since we are surrounded by Christmas carols that don't feel very accurate to the reality of the world that we're living, I took it upon myself to rewrite a Christmas carol. I'm going to have Audrey come up and lead this. We're going to learn this all real quick, okay? So we're gonna sing a Christmas carol. I don't know if this one's gonna take off or not. So we'll see. This is what I call a death positive alternate take on a carol called "Joy to the World." I'm gonna read it first. We're gonna learn it and sing it together. Joy to the world, we all will die. It's simply how we're made. So let our hearts be still in wonder as we feel the preciousness of breath, the nearness of our death, the beautiful, brief gift of breath. Since this is the joy to the world, you kind of have to stretch out the draw that, right? You got that? Okay, let's give it a go. So we're going to start from the top. We're just going to do the chorus here. Ready? How are we going to start off here, Audrey? Okay.
We're going to try to.
Yes, go for it.
Okay. Here's your note, and 1, 2, ready, go.
Joy to the world,
we all will die. It's simply how we're made. So let our hearts be still in wonder as we feel the preciousness of breath, the nearness of our death, the beautiful brief of death. Breath.
I don't know. Maybe it's just before, because talking about death and mortality is just not something our culture is really, really good at. Our weirdness around death. Am I off? Go back on? All right, let's try that again. I'm good now. All right, thank you. Our weirdness around death is a cultural failure, not a personal one. Caitlin Doty, who I've quoted, she's written a couple books on death and dying as a mortician and talks about death positivity. She says, looking mortality straight in the eye is no easy feat. To avoid the exercise, we choose to stay blindfolded, in the dark as to the realities of death and dying. But ignorance is not bliss, only a deeper kind of terror. You see, our weirdness around this, our uncomfortableness talking about our mortality is a defense mechanism. Because to actually contemplate our mortality, to remember the death of close loved ones, or the inevitable upcoming death of those that we love, it's a very difficult thing. And so we cover our eyes, and we call that normal. Our culture wants us to move past death and dying quickly, which is why those who go through that grieving process have sometimes at best a week to maybe a month where their loved ones and their friends will ask and check how they're doing. But what do you do maybe 6 months after someone lost a loved one, or 2 years later? I mean, at that point there, do you even still bring it up? Do you still talk about it? But we still need to talk about it. But we're not really good at talking about this in our culture. One of the ways that we've avoided confronting our mortality is with this term that I learned a few weeks ago. Lisa introduced it to me, called spiritual bypassing. Spiritual bypassing it's a term that comes from psychotherapist John Wellwood, who observed that people sometimes use spiritual ideas and concepts and language to sidestep unresolved wounds and emotional issues instead of working through them. Spiritual bypassing is using spiritual language and terms to dodge these hard feelings that we don't want to feel. I read a novel a few weeks ago, kind of in great timing with this whole series, called The Poppy Fields by Nikki Erlich. Some of you may have read her earlier book called The Measure. It was a book that was quite popular within our culture, where people received different amounts of string that was indicative of how much time they had left in this planet. And so thinking about death and dying and grieving is something that she as an author was very good at. And this new book called The Poppy Fields introduces this hypothetical treatment, so to speak, for grief and loss, where scientists discovered that if you could put a person into a prolonged sleep state for 4 to 8 weeks, that REM cycle would allow your body to process grief. And you can go into the Poppy Fields, this clinic, and engage in this sleep. And then when you wake up, you are all of a sudden feeling so much better. Not quite cured, but in a much more restorative state. And the only downside is that 1 out of 4 people who experience this treatment receive not just a resolution to their grief, but almost a numbness and a distance that cause them to feel the same about that loved one as they would their kindergarten teacher or school bus driver. And very interesting hypothetical story that felt very much of the moment to how our culture processes grief. Because you know that if there were a sleep treatment where you could sleep your grief and loss away, 4, 8 weeks, sign yourself up, and then you come out with that sense of resolution. Don't tell me that if we weren't in that spot of extreme pain that we wouldn't possibly consider that. Going through loss and grief is extremely uncomfortable. It hollows you out from the inside. And in your darkest moments, you're so desperate for anything to give you relief that you will consider just about anything. And so one of the ways that we do this in our culture is that spiritual bypassing. And the reason I'm pointing that out here is, as a spiritual community, it's so important that we learn to tackle grief and loss and death, and that we can do it in a way that confronts it with honesty, as Liz Friedman said a couple weeks ago, with curiosity, with compassion, but not sidestepping it, not glossing over these dark feelings. So spiritual bypassing looks like, and maybe you've heard phrases like this, oh, I'm so sorry, but they're in a better place now. God needed another angel in heaven. It looks like interpreting grief and loss and pain as part of a higher plan. One of the verses that still is deeply triggering for me from my former evangelical days is from Isaiah 55, and it's been used so horribly, so callously by so many people that God's ways are higher than our ways. We can't know God's plans, and so God must have had a better plan. And I've seen enough grief and loss. I've been at the bedsides of children to old people. I've done funerals for those whose deaths were expected and those who ended their life through suicide. And the reality is, as Megan Devine says, there's not a reason for everything. Not every loss can be transformed into something useful. Things happen that do not have a silver lining. I appreciate Mary Ellen's daughter's line in that letter as she said that she was even struggling with, like, it would almost be easier to sometimes convince yourself this happened for a reason. Because we're reason-seeking systems. We crave meaning. And when things happen to us, like death, especially unexpected death, untimely deaths, when those things happen to us, we'll latch on sometimes to almost anything to try to carve out a little bit of meaning. But it's okay to say sometimes that some grief, some loss, some deaths do not have a silver lining. We can make meaning out of those meaningless moments, but it's enough to just let those moments be, to sit with the grief, to sit with that with curiosity, with compassion. So I want to talk about a few different cultures and how different cultures handle and have had conversations around death and mortality to give us a little bit of insight and to get us out of the fishbowl that we're in. Because whether you realize this or not, if you've done any traveling around the world, especially if you've been involved in death care around the world, you realize that the United States and our Western way of handling death and dying in the funeral industry is very, very unique to us. And the things that have emerged as routine, as normal here, are things that are not necessarily shared with the rest of the world and are not necessarily helpful for those who are trying to process their grief. But it does work well if you're running an industry where you're trying to churn people through as quickly as you can. So in South Korea, it's become a trend in recent years for people to engage in mock funerals. Have you heard of this? There was an article I read that said that people will show up for a mock funeral and they're engaging with several practices, writing their own obituary, thinking about their own inevitable mortality. And then, quote, after the instructional lecture and video, participants are led into a dimly lit hall decorated with chrysanthemums, where they sit, often tearfully, beside caskets, and they write their last will and testament. They then put on burial shrouds and lay down in the coffins. A grim-looking man dressed in a black robe called, quote, the envoy from the other world, hammers the lid closed. The participants are left encased in utter darkness for 10 minutes, and the article says, which can feel like an eternity. Yes, I would imagine so. So would you participate in your own mock funeral? Would you allow yourself to be hammered into your own casket? Well, maybe we don't need to go that far, but there's a very real practice of engaging in mock mourning, in practicing your grieving that gives you a sense of perspective on your own mortality. Some within our own community have participated in other forms of alternative mock funerals. In some cases, it might look like digging a hole in the ground in the woods and then laying in that hole as you contemplate your own inevitable demise. For some, it looks like writing up a mock obituary, or what a new trend is emerging that I'm really fond of called the living obituary, where you write up your own obituary in the first person, and it's read from you in the first person, or in some cases, video, although some people struggle with that. But the parts of you that struggle with these things, if you think about it, when we step back and look at that, what is it that within us that is struggling with that? And is that really a culturally derived level of discomfort? Because for centuries, our species has experienced birth and death. They're two sides of the same coin. And it's only in our modern society, as we get more advanced and as we can prolong our inevitable and further, but not forever, that we choose to just say, I don't want to think about that. As a matter of fact, in pre-talk, that was a response that somebody said when we were saying, like, have you had these conversations with your kids or your loved ones about what a good death or what your death should look like? One person said that their kid's like, no, Mom, don't talk about that. I don't want to think about that. And that is natural in some ways because that brings up those uncomfortable things. I guess I would encourage us to maybe lean into that discomfort. As Liz said, with curiosity, to kind of ask what's underneath that level of discomfort and what can we learn by confronting it head on. Judaism gives us the practice of Shiva, sitting Shiva, where there are certain practices. Garments are rent as a physical reminder of loss. Shoes are taken off as you're entering the house, sign of respect, sign of the sacredness of the moment. And the family and the loved ones simply sit with their grief. Stories are told, some funny, some sad. The door is traditionally left unlocked so that family and friends can come and go. And this centuries-old tradition gives us the practice of moving through our grief slowly and intentionally. Mourning is communal. It's structured. You're not supposed to do it alone, plan it in a weekend, and then go back to work on a Monday. And yet, probably if you have participated in a very traditional Western funeral, you know how much stress there is about trying to get those details together and line it up with when people are going to show up, and you got to pick the right day and do everything if you can in one day, and then you're done. In ancient Egypt, reflections on mortality were a part of daily life, and dried skeletons were sometimes paraded into feasts and banquets at the height of the banquet to remind the revelers of the brevity of life. Talk about a party pooper, right? The height of the party, everything's banging, everybody's having fun, and then here comes the skeleton guy. You're going to die. This is going to be you one day, maybe even tonight if you keep drinking. Romans did the same thing. It's where we get the phrase that we have been using that we talk about, Memento Mori. I got this sticker here that I was saving for our last week here, so everybody can grab one on their way out. This is a sticker I designed a number of years back to help me in this process of remembering my mortality. And when I see it on my laptop or on my water bottle, and I'm reminded to think about death and mortality, to get comfortable Ars Moriendi is a Christian approach to this idea of remembering mortality, where skulls and bones were revered, were cherished. Anybody who's traveled over in Europe maybe has visited some of the resting places of saints, where some saints in the skeletons are so lavishly decorated with lace and jewels, and those bones even have a pilgrimage type quality where pilgrims will visit the bones of famous saints. But there wasn't a revulsion with death and the dying process. There was an embrace of it as part of life. Buddhism encourages practitioners to meditate on death to help reduce attachments in life. Buddhist monasteries will often have human skeletons on display in the meditation hall because it was a very real point of contemplation. It comes from the Satipatthana Sutra, where the Buddha laid out the essentials of mindfulness practice for his followers, and he included what was called a cemetery contemplation. The cemeteries back then often would have large plots of land, and not everyone was lovingly buried. Some were left out on the surface of the ground to replenish nature, to offer back to the animals and the birds and the carrion, because that was how life was. During life, I'm nourished by the plants and the animals that walk this earth, and when I die, my body can then be used to bring back those same nutrients into the earth. So there was a cemetery contemplation where the yogis would sit in the cemetery and contemplate the 9 stages of death. I won't go through them here because they're rather graphic and gruesome. Each stage marking a very real process of decomposition that the human body goes through, from being a fresh corpse all the way to white, dried bones that eventually turn back into dust. And at each stage of the cemetery contemplation, the yogi would sit and observe and say, this body of mine is of the same nature as that. This body of mine will become like that, and I cannot escape from it. What does that do for our mortality, our sense of meaning and purpose, when we spend time in contemplation of how precious life is, how fragile it is? All these practices circle the same question, though. If we're all headed there, is there such a thing as a good death? Because that's the title for this talk, and that feels like a kind of like an oxymoron to many of us, because good is good and death is bad, and you don't combine them. Death is always bad. Death always represents an ending, a loss, and life is good, right? But this idea of a good death has been around for centuries. It actually came first from the Greeks, who gave us the word euthanasia. Eu meaning good, thanatos meaning death, or a good death. Euthanasia means to choose what you would consider to be a good death. That word has morphed now under our context. But what does that mean in our context today, in a modern sense there? Caitlin Doty, she says it this way. She's like, for me, the good death includes being prepared to die, with my affairs in order, the good and the bad messages delivered that need delivering. The good death means dying while I still have my mind sharp and aware. Remember a few weeks ago, Michael shared the story of, I'm trying to think of her name, Amy, who wrote In Love, the one whose husband ended up traveling over to have his life ended through assisted means. It means dying without having to endure large amounts of suffering and pain. The good death means accepting death as inevitable and not fighting it when the time comes. This is my good death. But as legendary psychotherapist Carl Jung said, it won't help to hear what I think about death. Your relationship to mortality is your own. So what does the good death look like for us? In Greek culture, when they came up with that phrase, euthanasia, death had a different meaning. If you've seen the movie 300, you know that for the Spartans, to die in battle, to die gloriously was a good death. To die weakly or passively was a bad death. But in today's world, what is a good death for us? Well, some degree of the same themes that emerge in most of these conversations usually involve aspects of preparation for the end, not being surprised, astounded by the inevitability of our demise. It involves honesty, both with where we're at, the level, the quality, the amount of our relationships, our friendships, the things we've said or not said. Do we have anything left unspoken that needs to be spoken? Is there anything we've said that requires recompense or restitution? It involves a reduction of suffering, which we've become increasingly good at in our culture. And there's more and more tools available to us, but it's not guaranteed. And most importantly, it involves an acceptance of the inevitability of our mortality. Memento Mori. Remember you're mortal. Remember not just that you're mortal, but that it will happen for you, whether you're prepared for it or not. So why not spend the time, as uncomfortable as it is, contemplating your own impermanence? And is it possible that doing so may not have the effect that you would think that would send you into a pit of depression, but maybe as you spend time contemplating your mortality, as you spend time in those cemetery contemplations, maybe not staring at an actual corpse, but walking through a cemetery. In the first year that we were married, when Lisa and I got married back in 2000, our very first house where we had Chloe as an infant was right across the street from a beautiful cemetery. And we would routinely put her in the stroller and go for walks through the cemetery. And we laughed about it then because as a newly married young couple, it felt very antithetical to what we were experiencing. We were experiencing the newness of life, of birth, of things starting to open up. We had our whole lives in front of us. And yet I still distinctly remember the profound sense of peace, of contemplation that you achieve walking through cemeteries, spending time contemplating, this too shall be me. This too is my inevitable end. And it gives you a fresh appreciation for life. So maybe for us as we think about a good death, as Michael reminded us a few weeks ago, perhaps we may wish to spend some time thinking about our own advanced directives regarding our end of life. It's sad for those who work within the hospice and palliative care industry how frequently families have trauma layered on top of the trauma of difficult decisions because they haven't spent the time preparing advanced directives. The time to be talking about those things is not when you're in the hospital. Time to be talking about those things is now, as uncomfortable as they are. As Liz Friedman reminded us a couple weeks ago, we can learn to approach our own mortality with curiosity and compassion. This is especially true for those who have young children. because everything in us wants to shield our sweet, innocent children from the realities of death. And I'm rather fond of what Fred Rogers did, because in Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, he talked about things like death and dying. You might remember the episode with the goldfish in the tank. These are such precious, deep, intimate moments to have these conversations with our kids instead of doing like what many of us do, drive out to the nearest pet store and find the closest fish we can think of that will match and then try to pretend like nothing happened. It's magic. There's no death here. Can we approach it with curiosity? Can we lean into the questions our kids ask instead of trying to convince them that their curiosity is somehow indicative of some deep sense of macabre fascination with the end? Maybe you need to plan your own mock funeral. Maybe you need to take a practice and a journal and write up your obituary as it would be written right now if you were to pass. What would you say? How do you sum up your life? I would dare say that that practice would probably lead to some profound life changes as you think about the person you want to be moving forward. Perhaps like the Jewish practice of sitting Shiva, you learn to sit with your heavy emotions around grief and loss instead of spiritual bypassing. Instead of introducing language that makes it easier to swallow and easier to not quite confront it. Like the ancient Egyptians or the Romans, you might need a tangible memento mori. Maybe it's a sticker. Maybe it's something that you carry with you as a reminder. And to bring it out especially in the moments when life is going swimmingly and everything's wonderful. Or you might adopt the Buddhist cemetery contemplation and reflect how all of our bodies will meet the same inevitable fates. So sometime this week, before bed or after a meal, as we're wrapping up this series, but not putting it away because the reality of death and mortality is always with us. We only stop talking about it, but it never goes away. So maybe before bed or after a meal, you can take a moment in contemplation to say to yourself, one day my life will end. The people I love are temporary too. Knowing this, how do I choose to live today? One day my life will end, and it's inevitable. The lives of those I love are also headed to that same fate. How do I choose to live now in the light of that reality? Most of what makes for a good death doesn't happen in the final hours or even in the final weeks. It happens now in the conversations that you have, the things you write, from the deeply practical, like advance directives and power of attorneys and all of the crazy things that accompany death in the United States, to the abstract and intangible, like how do I sum up my life in 500 words? It happens now in the conversations we have, in the forgiveness that we offer, in the boundaries that we set, in the rituals that we practice to remember the ones that we've lost, the ways that we tend to this brief, beautiful life while we still have it. So may we remember the dead with tenderness. May we face our own mortality with a little more curiosity, a little more openness. And may that awareness that we carry with us help us live more deeply and truly in these moments that we have here now. Namaste, friends.